All right. Hey there, folks. Today we're going to talk about the $100 million identity risk. And so if you have been sleeping under a log for the last few months or quarters, you may have missed that worker impersonation identity is a major HR risk these days. And what does that have to do with how security teams and HR teams have to work together to ultimately alleviate a lot of these concerns around how employees are being verified either at onboarding, credential recovery, interview process, so on and so forth. So today we're going to talk about just some questions that you should ask or have answers to as you go down this path of really partnering with HR and security, especially if you work in identity around identity verification efforts, because it is a growing understanding that organizations can no longer just simply rely upon knowledge-based questions and answers or basic I-9 type of verification when they're onboarding their employees, or even when they're interviewing people. There's a lot of pain these days that companies feel where the individual that they onboard isn't the person that they interviewed. So how do we stop that? Well, we need better controls, and ultimately we also need much better rules in place and understanding and compliance checks to ensure that this is done properly. So let's walk through some of these questions that we should all be very much aware of. So ultimately, most organizations today, when they verify employees or applicants, they're doing it just based on knowledge-based factors or maybe very manual or just looking at some of these documents. And the fact is these days, we can use AI to generate fake documents really cheaply and easily. You can bypass a lot of these verification systems using these fake generated documents. And ultimately, a lot of times, organizations are now having to struggle with individuals using deepfakes, where they are somebody in another country and they are posing as maybe somebody in the United States. Who is a fake person who's applying for a job. There was an instance recently where there was a well-known developer on GitHub, and they had a well-known profile on there, and a malicious person was using their face as a deepfake on an interview and pretending to be that person to get the job. Right? And so it's really simple to do these days, and these verification requirements may differ across different roles, regions, systems. Sometimes you want to do a lot more verification for a senior role or somebody who has access to critical systems, versus if you're onboarding an intern, for example, maybe you don't need as many or as strict of the requirements. Companies really have to worry about what happens when we ask somebody to be verified and they refuse to do a certain step, right? How do we make sure that everybody can be verified appropriately? Like, is the system accessible? For the most part, everybody can make a phone call and answer questions. The accessibility problem there has been largely solved. However, now that we're having to leverage more technology in the verification process, how do we ensure that those individuals can get through the workflow successfully? A few questions we need to ask. First, what policies must be updated before workforce identity verification can go live? This is really important. A lot of these verification systems, they require individuals to provide, phone numbers, locations, maybe their government issued documents, your handbooks, contract agreements, offer letters, all need to take these things into account, right? These things are important. So these policies should be documented, they should be understood, they should be communicated. And this is where security, IT, and security really need to work together and have a unified front when it comes to communicating and making sure that everybody across the leadership team is aligned to this. So really, before launching a verification workflow that is more robust than just knowledge-based answers, you got to look at your various departments and make sure that you align with the communication strategy across these various departments, and that the decisions and the language is put into these documents as employees are being onboarded or evaluated. The second question is, how will the organization handle refusal across interviews, onboarding, and in the current workforce? So many organizations are doing things like saying, hey, even if you're an existing employee or a contractor, you have to go through a re-verification process because we need to have a really strong baseline of verification. And sometimes people just refuse um, to provide certain information, right? They're like, hey, why are you asking me to provide my document or scan it with this app or so on and so forth? Sometimes there's regional issues, right? So certain countries such as Germany or France or even certain states in the US have certain biometric privacy laws where certain types of verification checks could be really difficult to do unless you have explicit user consent, and that it could be even illegal if you're persisting any sort of that information the wrong way. So the fact is, not everybody is going to be able to go through the workflows that you might be implementing. So you need to have a map of like what happens when people refuse, right? That could be as simple as, well, if you refuse to do this remotely, this verification process, you got to get in a car and drive to the office so we can verify you. Like, but that may not be reasonable or available to all sorts of companies. So you need to have maybe a different workflow around like doing a really secure video verification that makes sure that deepfakes aren't being used, so on and so forth. So putting this into a matrix and going through those waterfall scenarios of what if people refuse X, we will do Y is really important. The third question is, how do you ensure fairness, right? Accessibility and really compliance across the workforce. So this is where things like document scan bias and things like that can be tough, right? Certain device limitations. There's still people with flip phones out there, and you ask them to take a picture of their driver's license with their photo, for example, or with their camera on their phone, for example, and that's not something that they can necessarily do, right? Lighting conditions. There are many situations where document verification just fails, right? So what do you do if people cannot get through that process? How do you escalate them to a more still secure but a different workflow path is really important. Accessibility requirements are critical. People who have visual disabilities, hearing disabilities, so on and so forth, need to be able to get through any sort of application or verification process that you're implementing. Otherwise, you can't deploy it, right? The vast majority of countries and states now require ADA compliance with any sort of employee-facing software because people need to be able to use this capability to do their job. Global teams requirements could be very different. There's no one size fits all, right? Especially if you have users in places like China, where lots of things are much, much harder due to the Great Firewall. If you have employees in places like India, Vietnam, different parts of Southeast Asia or Africa in particular, where there are still many documents out there that don't even have a photo of the person on them, right? They're just paper. And so being able to take into account these restrictions and making sure that people can still be verified successfully is really important, and making sure this process is fair. Look, at the end of the day, these people want to do their jobs, they want to be successful, they want to grow in their careers, and we want to enable them to do that securely. So you should always have a primary path that is the one that is the happy path, right? That most people can get through, but you need to have a equivalently safe alternative path for people in different countries. And so any solution provider that you're working with to deliver strong identity verification should have these answers for you, or should have these capabilities to ensure that individuals can get through this verification process. And then disclosure and consent are super important, right? So what consent, disclosure, and data handling languages must exist? This is not just the paperwork, but in the actual product itself, right? People don't read emails. People don't typically read all the employee handbook updates that get sent out as an organization. So consent usually has to be in the workflow itself. And workers really need clarity about what data is being captured, how long that data is retained, how that data is stored, is it encrypted, is it not, and who has access to that data. So being upfront with all of these details with legal, privacy, HR, and security, this is really critical because that's what is going to provide the transparency and trust that your employees will need as part of this process. Creating a consent module and having that be highly configurable is very important, and working with your legal team is really key to ensure that everybody has a fair understanding. And then finally, ultimately, where does this verification sit in the life cycle, right? And how does it tie into access provisioning and ongoing trust? And so we see organizations implementing strong identity verification as early as the interview process, right? And then be it onboarding, also credential recovery, or when people are promoted into different roles, right? If somebody is in a certain position at a company and their access is limited and they're already an onboarded employee, but they get promoted and now they have a lot more access, maybe we want to re-verify them to establish that baseline of trust. And if somebody is not able to get through the verification flow or they fail multiple times, especially, being able to know that in the moment and being able to respond to that in the moment is really important, right? That because that means somebody, who is not that person could be knocking on the door, and that is a risk to the business. So making sure that you know that that account is being targeted and how you can respond to that by not allowing it access is critical. So what you have to do here is build a lifecycle map, right? Think about your employee lifecycle from interview, day 0, day 1, promotion, changes in role, whether they're a contractor or a remote employee, like what type of verifications do you need and what type of best practices are being used in the industry to ensure that you're not opening up your organization to risk. So I hope this was useful for you today. If you have any questions, reach out to us. We here at HYPR, we work with so many companies every single week, helping them navigate a lot of these questions that they are being asked across the organization. So if you're a security leader or an HR leader or in IT, and you're trying to figure out and navigate this entire landscape of, hey, now we have to have a much stronger verification process for our employees, our contractors, or third parties. Where do we put these processes in and how do they look? Please feel free to reach out to us anytime, and I would be glad to answer these questions for you and many more. And if we don't have the answers, we'll get them for you. Thank you so much.